This novel is a little different than most other Niven novels in that it ties together many of Niven's older short stories and explains a few discrepancies that he accidentally made while still developing his universe. For the most part, Juggler of Worlds shows previous short stories through the eyes of Nessus and Sigmund Ostfaller. So despite being a Fleet of Worlds novel, most of the action happens outside of the Fleet of Worlds. We get a taste of this in the Fleet of Worlds novel, where Nessus sets up the background for the short story The Borderland of Soul. When Nessus gives Dr. Julian Forward the tech he needed to develop a system for creating the neutronium he feeds to his primordial black hole. In this novel, we will explore that further, as well as tackle most of the stories from the novel Crashlander and Neutron Star, as well as one other, called There Is a Tide, which was the last video I put out. So with that in mind, I've made a playlist with all of the relevant short stories for this novel, called the Juggler of Worlds playlist. You might want to consider watching that before watching this video. I will also try to remember to put links to them on screen as they come up in this novel. But I'm terrible at remembering things like that, so I'm sorry if I forgot. So I will also tell you a list of them right now. In chronological order, within the known space universe, they are Neutron Star, At the Core, Flatlander, Grendel, The Borderland of Soul, Procrustes, The Soft Weapon, and There Is a Tide. I will try to remember to link these vids in this video's info as well. So with all that being said, let's start seeing those stories from Sigmund and Nessus's perspectives. Juggler of Worlds starts off with Sigmund already having been captured by the Trojan Mafia, a mafia operating out of Jupiter's Trojan asteroids. These are asteroids that stay in the Lagrangian points of Jupiter. If you don't know what Lagrangian points are, then I would definitely suggest looking into them. The mechanics of space and gravity can be pretty strange, and these are, in my opinion, pretty interesting. At this time, Sigmund just works for the UN as a financial analyst. He was diagnosed with several kinds of paranoia as a kid after his parents died in a small border conflict with the Kazin, and everyone knew that Kazin ate their enemies. This had traumatized Sigmund and caused him to lose trust in the world around him. Once this was diagnosed, he had been prescribed drugs to make him quote-unquote normal, yet he tried not to take them. Because of this, his paranoia persisted and crept into every aspect of his life, including his job as a financial analyst, which is what led him to be tied up on the floor of a spaceship now. In walked Sigmund's boss. Suddenly, it was all clear to him. No wonder why his investigations into this area had always been stymied, and his information had gone nowhere. His boss worked for the Trojan Mafia. He had been placing barriers in the way of Sigmund's work. Sigmund pinched his leg, desperate to unmuddle his thoughts.
How much dope did you give me?
He demanded.
Enough.
Grimaldi looked pointedly at his wrist implant.
I must be going soon. Your stay here will be much more pleasant if you answer our questions voluntarily.
More pleasant, perhaps. Also shorter? Did buying time matter?
Why the Trojans?
Why would you think, Ostfaller? They made a generous offer for my assistance. Official scrutiny is bad for their business. You're an odd one, Sigmund, but I admit you're capable, persistent. I truly wish I thought we could buy you. Sadly, you inherited piles of money. You still choose to work for a pittance at the UN.
Grimaldi shook his head.
You live like a monk. You dress like a monk. Why offer you money when you ignore the wealth you already have? It seems too likely you have principles.
And there it was, the memory Sigmund had struggled for. Money. He tried and failed to blink away the fuzziness.
Perhaps I can pay you.
A reflexive flash of contempt, and then, more slowly, an expression of low cunning. Grimaldi said,
You'd still have to tell everything you've learned about me and my associates, and every detail about how you learned. It won't do for someone else to discover what you did.
Understood.
You wouldn't try to trick me now, would you?
Of course not.
Grimaldi smacked his hands together. Strangely, that assurance had sufficed.
Stet. There will be no negotiation. 1 million stars transferred into the numbered Belter account I will give you. Don't bother to protest. I know you're good for it. When your weekly reports began to show progress, I made it a point to learn about you. Here's the deal, Mr. Osfaller. You pay. You tell all. Then we let you go.
He'd never be let go. But Sigmund acted as though he believed. Anyway, the million and change he thought Grimaldi could trace was merely the fraction of Sigmund's wealth he intended to be visible, and it wasn't as though there was anyone to leave his money to. At worst, the charade might make his final hours less unpleasant. Sigmund raised his arms, clanking on purpose.
For 1 million stars, I want these off. I want a nicer room. A suite with plumbing would be good.
We'll see about that after the funds clear. Until then, maybe a pot.
Grimaldi took a sonic stunner and a handheld computer from pockets of his bodysuit. He whispered inaudibly into the handheld set it on the deck, and then slid it with his shoe tip towards Sigmund. Handheld and foot never came within Sigmund's reach. The sonic stunner was fixed on him.
I'm logging into an anonymous account. All other comm functions are locked out. Moments after my funds are received, they'll be shifted elsewhere.
Grimaldi laughed.
My colleagues, as I'm sure you know, are skilled in anonymous transfers.
My funds. Sigmund held in his anger.
Funds transfer from the Bank of North America.
He paused for the voice print check.
Account 541.
He articulated slowly and distinctly, leaving no chance for misinterpretation. Account number, sub-account, access codes. The good news was the response time. He was still on Earth. The stunner never wavered. He'd be lucky to utter a suspicious syllable without being zapped.
429er.
The bank AI spoke a challenge code. Grimaldi snorted in disgust. He wiggled the stunner, just a bit, in warning. Sigmund shrugged. Clank. With the challenge response feature set, a bank would accept transfer authorizations only in real time. Challenge response defeated coerced recordings. What rational person didn't configure his account this way? Sigmund could authorize the transfer with a duress code. That would alert his bank. But so what? Money laundering was big business for the Trojans. Within minutes of the money's release, it would be laundered through a dozen shell companies, off-world tax havens, and other anonymous venues. The duress code would accomplish nothing. If he purposefully aborted the transfer, Grimaldi would know instantly, and the coming questioning could become a lot less pleasant. Or, Dr. Swenson had been right. Sigmund was paranoid, and now, he thought, we'll see if I've been paranoid enough. Sigmund remained in chains, but he'd been offered a chair, an improvised chamber pot, and a greasy drinking bulb with tepid water. For 1 million stars, there should have been at least a leaded glass tumbler and ice. Grimaldi was long gone. He had delegated the detailed questioning to the lanky belter Sigmund had met earlier. His interrogator disdained to offer a name. Sigmund chose to think of him as Astyanax, Hector's little boy, hurled from the ramparts of Troy. Like Achilles' son, Sigmund wanted no more kings of Troy. Slow, pensive sips didn't buy much time. All crimes lead to tax evasion. Sigmund had concentrated his quest for the Trojans there. He discoursed methodically on forensic techniques and spotting hidden income, waxing ever more pedantic. Whenever Astyanax began looking impatient, Sigmund offered a tidbit about which banking investigations had suggested what line of further investigation. A few such admissions evoked surprisingly astute questions. The Belter was something of an expert himself on income tax evasion. A handheld in Astyanax's pocket squawked in alarm. There was sudden pandemonium in the corridor, thudding footsteps, thudding bodies, the unmistakable zap of sonic stunners. Astyanax dropped his own stunner and took a utility knife from his belt. Low tech, but lethal.
Don't. You'll only make it worse.
He gasped in shock at the sudden agony in his stomach. His shirt and Astyanax's hand were bright red, lifeblood red. Nothing personal, Astyanax said. As Sigmund slumped, a squad of battle-armored arms burst through the door. To the frying bacon sound of stunners as everything went dark, Sigmund thought, too late. This was the first time Sigmund died. Sigmund awoke in an autodock. It said his heart, part of his liver, and more had been replaced. The autodock opened and he saw a very tall and athletic woman standing over him. She looked like she was almost a bodybuilder. Her name was Feather Phillip, and she told him that his skills were wasted at his old job. She had decoded the message in his PIN number and had deduced that he had purposefully made questionable transfers with the accounts to get the ARM, the Amalgamated Regional Militia, which was the UN's police force, watching it. He had set up multiple accounts, each incriminating a different person or group he was investigating. The PIN for the account he had paid off his boss with was a numerical cipher for his boss's name. Since the ARM was watching his accounts, just as he wanted, when a suspicious transfer of 1,000,000 stars came through, they paid attention. Nobody but a genius paranoid could have pulled this off, so they offered him a job at the ARM. He was just the kind of person they were always looking for. Every ARM investigator was a paranoid. They saw it as a virtue. You can't be caught unaware if you suspect everyone. And thus, Sigmund's employment with the ARM began. Neutron Star. A few years later, the puppeteer named Nessus was on a mission to find out what had happened to two humans who worked for him, a husband and wife, the Laskins. They were supposed to make a close slingshot maneuver around BVS-1, an old, cold, dead neutron star, but they had failed to report back in. So he was with a second crew of humans. The three of them had gone to BVS-1 and were searching the area for the Laskins' ship. They found it, but when they were able to board, the sight was not pleasant. Sigmund was in the middle of a mission to secretly look into the Institute of Knowledge based out of Jinx. The Jinxians were a terrifying people, living on a massive moon orbiting a gas giant. The gravity on this moon was 1.78 times that of Earth's, so every Jinxian was built like a tank. The perfect place to raise an army of super soldiers, Sigmund thought to himself. What if that army was sent to fight Earth? The Institute of Knowledge was secretive and was a leader in tech development. If Earth had anything to fear from Jinx, it would be related to them. But so far, his investigation had turned up nothing. So he was headed for the planet called We Made It, to see what he could dig up there. This is when he got a communication from the RMHQ. Two humans had died in one of General Products' self-proclaimed indestructible halls. The puppeteer built halls that they sold to humans. This was a very intriguing turn of events, and possibly a way for the ARM to get more information out of the secretive puppeteers. So Sigmund, as the closest ARM agent, was reassigned to this mission. Sigmund went straight to the General Products office when he landed on We Made It and spoke with the puppeteer in charge. Once he understood the situation, he gave suggestions to this puppeteer running the GP facility on We Made It. When Sigmund asked for his name, the puppeteer decided only to use his real name, which was completely unpronounceable to a human. So Sigmund decided to dub him Adonis for his garish mane decorations. Sigmund suggested Adonis should find an out-of-work pilot from the recently defunct Nakamura Cruise Lines. He even did the background research to find one who had kept up his spending as if he still worked for them, amassing a rather large debt in the process. One Beowulf Schaefer. With Adonis's help, he blackmailed Schaefer into accepting the suicide mission of repeating the Laskins' flyby of BVS-1. Get a 1,000,000-star payout to do the mission, or go to debtor's prison. Reluctantly, Schaefer accepted. Sigmund kept an eye on the situation, but when he got the specs for the ship Schaefer had requested from General Products, his eyes bulged. It was heavily armed, the universe's first ever puppeteer-built warship. It made sense. Schaefer would be facing an unknown threat. Who knows what he might need? But then another thought occurred to Sigmund. This ship was priceless. What if Schaefer decided to abandon the mission and just go sell it off to pay for his debt? Or even become a pirate? What ship could match a puppeteer-built warship? Very few, if any. The puppeteer's tech was far more advanced than humanity's, so Sigmund decided to meet with Schaefer and inform him of the insurance plan he had thought up. He found Schaefer in a bar, and without introducing himself, sat at his table. Schaefer immediately got up to leave. Sigmund told him to sit down, and informed him of the bomb he had just hidden aboard Schaefer's new warship, which Schaefer had named the Skydiver. If Schaefer did not carry out his mission, then Sigmund would detonate the bomb. He felt a little bad for having to do this, but what other choice did he have? Releasing a puppeteer-built warship on the universe would be insane, and it would also cause a huge problem for human-puppeteer relations. If Schaefer did not fulfill his part of the contract he made with the puppeteers, then they would expect the human government to make up for this breach. You don't break a contract you made with another race. Who knows what the fallout might be? And the puppeteers were far advanced of humans in tech, and while the puppeteers knew where every human colony world was, humans had no clue where the puppeteer homeworld or worlds were. Being a very cowardly race, they kept that secret very well hidden. The puppeteers could wipe out most of humanity on a whim, while humanity would have no ability to respond in kind. So Schaefer set out on his mission, only to return several days later with a bright red sunburn and the answer to what had killed the Laskins. You can watch my video called Neutron Star now if you want to see that full story from Beowulf's point of view. Now that the puppeteers had the answer to what had breached through their indestructible hull and killed two people, gravity, tidal forces, they needed Beowulf to write a story for the press telling the tale, otherwise people would lose faith in their product. But Beowulf was no writer, so he put out an ad into the local paper looking for a ghostwriter. Sigmund saw this ad. He was even partially expecting it, having studied Schaefer's file thoroughly. Schaefer was no writer. His school grades in writing proved that, so Sigmund sent one of his own agents to answer the ad and go do the story for Schaefer as his ghostwriter. 4 years later, the arm suddenly discovered that every GP building on Earth was empty. The puppeteers had all fled in secret. Sigmund contacted other human worlds and found it was the same on every one of them. They were even gone from every other species worlds that humans were in contact with. Without a single word, every puppeteer in known space had vanished overnight. Sigmund was placed in charge of the investigation. What could this mass exodus mean? Why did it happen? And what were the results? The first thing to become apparent was the stock market crash. GP sold more than just spaceship hulls. Almost every business on Earth relied on GP to some degree. It wasn't long before stock traders began to try and learn how to fly on the way out their windows, with the typical amount of success. The industry on Earth and on all other known worlds was in shambles. Almost no other corporation made spaceship hulls. They simply could not compete. Many companies were claiming bankruptcy and shutting down. Others were hurriedly trying to retool their manufacturing plants to fill holes in the market or learn how to make parts they had always purchased before, just to be able to continue making their products. Supply and demand was going haywire. Then the reason came, and to Sigmund's shock, once again, it was Beowulf Schaefer with the answer. Watch my video called At the Core for that short story, once again from Beowulf Schaefer's perspective. The galaxy was exploding, and we only knew because GP had reverse engineered an outsider hyperdrive and then modified it. It could now travel at the insane speed of 1 light year every 75 seconds, as opposed to the original hyperdrive that could do a light year in 3 days. Beowulf had been hired by GP to make a trip to the core of the galaxy as a promotional stunt for their new hyperdrive, and what he had found there was a chain reaction of supernovae that was sending out a wave of radiation that would sterilize every planet in the galaxy. This was why all the puppeteers had left. Or almost all of them. Nessus had been chosen to be the sole puppeteer to remain on Earth. GP, or more accurately, the Concordance, since unbeknownst to the humans, GP and the puppeteer government were one and the same, had decided they still needed to watch the humans, as they could still conceivably be a danger to them, and the puppeteers were notorious cowards. To leave a possible enemy unwatched would be insanity, no matter how unlikely it was that they would do anything against the puppeteers. Through his spies, Nessus had found that Sigmund and his branch of the arm were diligently searching for any information about the puppeteers. So to stifle this, he decided the best course of action was to contact Sigmund, hoping to reassure Earth that the puppeteer exodus had nothing to do with any insidious plans for humanity. Nessus brought Sigmund to his untraceable location and introduced himself. Sigmund, much to Nessus's amusement, told him that he had dubbed the president of the GP facilities on We Made It, Adonis, for his main. Nessus, who had always rejected the tradition of stylizing your main to show your social status, found this amusing. Even a human could see how highly the egotistical Achilles thought of himself, going overboard with his gaudy main decorations. Adonis was an appropriate name for Achilles and his garish and laughably overcompensating style. He was a scout, not the hindmost. Oh, how highly he thought of himself. Well, at least he had the common sense not to tell humans his chosen name was Achilles. What would they think of that silliness? A cowardly puppeteer naming himself after a legendary human warrior, a half-god. All citizen scouts were considered insane, but clearly some were more insane than others. Nessus told Sigmund that he had stayed behind to do what he could to make the puppeteer disappearance less harmful to Earth. His people were cowards, proud of it in fact. They thought of other species as reckless. But despite the fact that when they saw danger, they must act on it as soon as possible, they did not intend to harm the other races they did business with. That was an unfortunate side effect. So Nessus would do whatever he could to lessen that impact, and to try to make it so the humans did not hate puppeteers for abandoning them. It turned out that on Jinx, Achilles had befallen the same fate as Nessus. He was the sole representative of GP left behind on the planet. This is when the events of the short story called Flatlander happen, which was published in both the collection of short stories called Crashlander and the collection called Neutron Star, which thankfully also has the story titled Neutron Star in it, as this is already confusing enough, because there is also a collection of short stories called Flatlander, but the short story Flatlander is not in that collection. The novel Flatlander is a collection of short stories about Gil the Arm Hamilton set around 500 years before the events of the short story titled Flatlander, which is about Beowulf Schaefer. So, long story short, my video on the collection called Crashlander has the short story titled Flatlander. So watch the video titled Crashlander now if you want to know the details of that story. I apologize for how confusing this is. When Gregory Pelton and Beowulf Schaefer limped back to Jinx in what remained of their ship, they contacted the only remaining rep of GP there, Achilles. But Achilles had been alone for months at this point, his ship hiding in the deadly pressures of the belt of Jinx, where it was safe from humans, but still an incredibly dangerous place to be for any puppeteer. The loneliness and the danger had worn down Achilles' already fragile mental state. He was depressed and paranoid and half delusional from this post. So when Pelton explained what had happened to destroy his GP hull, Achilles just blurted out the explanation without thinking, exposing GP's secrets that even most Concordance citizens did not know. When he caught himself, Achilles felt like a fool. Thankfully, Pelton was too rich and too in shock to realize the value of the golden ticket he had just been handed for free. Instead, Pelton just felt foolish for being mad at Beowulf for the past 3 months, for Beowulf not letting Pelton kill both of them with his ignorance. Thankfully, Beowulf was too good of a friend to rub it into Pelton, and too busy patting himself on the back to critically think about what Achilles had just blurted out. After all, Achilles had offered the information so freely, it couldn't be that big of a secret, right? It must just be common sense that antimatter can destroy a GP Hall. So, the three fools went their separate ways. 2 of them embarrassed by their own actions, and the third proud of how smart he was. But once again, Sigmund was left in shock. How could Schaefer always be involved in the most dangerous events in known space? First, he had found what had killed the Laskins through their GP Hall. Then, he had been the cause of the puppeteer exodus. And now, he had found a way to destroy the supposedly indestructible halls completely, and he refused to say how it happened. And from Sigmund's research, he had to be telling the truth. The only other option was that he had found some way to disassemble the entire insides of the ship, take them all out the airlock, and completely reassemble the ship with no GP Hall, and then fly that back to known space for no apparent reason at all. All the part numbers matched. It was the same ship. But why would he do that and then be silent on the subject? Just to blackmail GP? But how would he explain to them how it happened in a way that they would not be able to tell was a lie? Only GP knew how GP halls were built. Therefore, only GP would know how one would come apart. And if Beowulf knew enough to trick GP into believing it, then he did know enough to destroy a hall regardless, and wouldn't need to do the ruse in the first place. But Pelton blocked Sigmund's investigations with his resources and connections, so Sigmund was stuck in a dead end. What Sigmund did not know was that Pelton was not up to anything nefarious. He was just planning a return trip to the antimatter planet and didn't want anyone messing up his plans. He was going to be the first human to plant a flag on an antimatter planet, and he was going to record the explosion when he did. And then no one would ever call him a Flatlander again, and he would be damned if he was going to let the arm stop him. But to Sigmund's paranoid mind, this looked like some kind of ongoing conspiracy with Jinx and Schaefer, and now Pelton, one of the richest men on Earth, involved. And the Outsiders. There was no other way for Pelton's ship to reach the speeds it was traveling when it entered the Jinx star system. 80% of light speed. Only the Outsiders could reach such speeds in the short amount of time Pelton and Schaefer were gone. The ship certainly could never go that fast on its own. It would have taken too long, and run out of fuel long before that anyway. Independently, the puppeteers had come to the same conclusion. The Outsiders must have sold the information to Pelton and Schaefer, and then given them and their ship a boost up to 0.8 light speed. It would be easy for the Outsiders. Their city-sized ships were known to go from a stop to almost full light speed in an instant. But that was not the danger. The danger was that now the humans had access to an entire planet's worth of antimatter. Pound for pound, the most dangerous substance in the universe. When an antimatter atom met a normal atom, they would annihilate each other in a total conversion explosion. That means converting matter to pure energy. Just a few pounds of antimatter had the potential to decimate an entire planet if used right. I was curious, so I did some quick research, and according to that, please excuse me if it's wrong, I didn't check the math myself, 3.5 kilograms of antimatter would make an explosion like Krakatoa. The Tsar Bomba, the biggest nuclear bomb ever detonated, was about the equivalent of 1 kilogram of antimatter. But why drop it all in one spot? If you drop just 0.3 grams of antimatter, you would get an explosion equal to Hiroshima. That's less than 1/3 of a gram of antimatter. That means you could get the equivalent of over 3,300 of Hiroshima-sized bombs just from 1 kilogram of antimatter. When you consider that there are only 512 cities on Earth with a population over a million, this means you can easily hit every major city on Earth multiple times with just 1 kilogram of antimatter. This would completely wipe out trade and commerce worldwide, as well as cause huge destruction and massive loss of life like the Earth has never seen before. So with this danger in mind, Nessus, as the last puppeteer on Earth, was tasked with closely watching Beowulf Schaefer and Gregory Pelton to assure they never got back to that antimatter planet. Between the two, Nessus and Sigmund, both watching Pelton, mistakes were made, and Pelton noticed he was being spied on. Pelton did not know that it was more than just the arm watching him, so he blamed it all on them, and used his political connections and power to get Sigmund reassigned. Nothing went well for Sigmund after that. His plans all seemed to fail. He had managed to get reassigned to a place that would oversee Schaefer at his new home in Alaska with his wife, Cheryl Jans, in the hopes he could continue his investigation in secret. But Pelton was untouchable, and Schaefer and his wife did not renew their wedding contract and split up. Schaefer left Earth, and Cheryl married Carlos Wu. And even worse than all that, with a law and legitimate cases to work, Sigmund ended up on a mother hunt with Feather, who he had developed a relationship with. Feather desperately wanted children, but both she and Sigmund were diagnosed paranoid schizophrenics. The Earth Fertility Board would never give either of them a birth license. Earth was already overcrowded. Unregulated reproduction would kill the planet and everyone on it, so why let the genetically inferior have babies? So now, here were Sigmund and Feather, two people who wanted children but were not legally allowed to have them, hunting people who were not legally allowed to have children but did it anyway. No arm liked to be on a mother hunt, but for Feather, it was torture, and she was beginning to break down. Nessus was faring not much better. It turned out that the evacuation ship from Earth, carrying all of his coworkers, had never arrived at Hearth, the puppeteer homeworld. Something had happened to it. Most believed that since there was no sign of it anywhere to be found, that the puppeteer manning the mass indicator had either been in too much of a hurry to get home, or, more likely, had fallen to stress-induced catatonia at the worst time possible and not dropped the ship out of hyperspace when it neared Hearth. And it had been lost to the singularity, where hyperdrive no longer functioned. Any ship that entered a gravitational singularity while still in hyperspace was never seen from again, and no scientist, human or puppeteer, knew why yet. When the puppeteers had learned of the galaxy exploding, many had instantly fallen into catatonia, and those not on Hearth had to be carried to their ships for evacuation. Others had fallen into catatonia during the flights back to Hearth from all the various inhabited worlds. It seemed plausible that the stress of hyperspace, combined with the galaxy's core explosion, had driven too many into catatonia, leaving just one to watch the mass pointer on the ship returning to Hearth from Earth. This would add even more stress to that individual, until finally he also had succumbed. So now all the fellow citizens Nessus had worked with on Earth, all his friends for the past several years, were dead, and he was still alone on this alien world. He could not handle it any longer, so he uncharacteristically sent a request back to Hearth. Gregory Pelton was building his new ship on Jinx. Beowulf Schaefer was no longer on Earth. General Products dealings had been wrapped up long ago. He had no real reason to stay any longer. He wanted to come home. He had even thought up a mission he could accomplish back on Hearth. With the loss of so many scouts, not just his friends, but many others that had fallen to catatonia on other planets, what if he started a human scouting program? What if he could train humans to scout for the fleet? Not wild humans, of course. Letting them know the location of the fleet would be too dangerous. But they were not the only humans. For the next several months, Nessus spent his time on Nature Preserve 4, training Kirsten, Omar, and Eric how to fly a spaceship and scout ahead of the fleet. He worked with them until Nike called him personally to his office and informed him that back on Earth, Sigmund was still hunting for the fleet. And Nessus was forced to go back to human space with the idea to rig their birthright lottery as a distraction. Achilles had also spoken to Nike and had come up with his own idea to deter Earth's search for the fleet. He found a moon orbiting a habitable planet between Earth and the fleet. Here, he brought a special device and set it up on the surface of the small moon, and initiated the device from a safe distance. A ripple was sent through space-time as massive energies were released, and the small moon turned into a very small sphere of neutronium about 10 feet in diameter. This is the planet where almost 200 years later, Louis Wu will meet the Trinox for the first time in the short story, There Is a Tide. But now, in the 2600s, 3 human ships were lost to this same trap of Achilles's as the Trinox ship will eventually be in the 2800s. These disappearing ships caught Sigmund's attention. The loss of hyperdrive ships were rare, and 3 to be lost so close in time to each other was noteworthy, and all were headed in the same direction, to the galactic north. Since Nessus was watching Sigmund, he noticed Sigmund's attention being drawn in the direction of the fleet by these missing ships. He spoke with Nike, who confirmed that Achilles had set the trap that caught them. Achilles thought that he was protecting the fleet from any ships that would get near. Instead, he had drawn the attention of the arm. Nessus would have to make up for this blunder in some way. But how? Well, if Sigmund was focusing on missing ships, then why not give him some more? Nessus made a call to Forward Station, orbiting in the borderland of Sol. After Nessus had set his plan into motion, he was once again called back to the fleet. It seemed Nessus had a missing ship of his own to deal with now. The domesticated humans he had trained had disappeared during their first scouting mission alone. Back on Earth, 8 more ships had now disappeared. Trade between worlds had all but shut down in fear. Only 9 ships had been lost since the invention of the hyperdrive, before this new danger, whatever it may be, arose. Achilles had made that number 12 with his misguided protection of the fleet. And now, these last 8 ships in only 10 months, almost as many ships as has been lost in the first 200 years of hyperdrive. Sigmund was forced to do something about it. He had to take drastic action, and he could not trust this mission to anyone else. Who knew how far the puppeteer's strings could reach? As he was becoming more and more sure, the puppeteers were making those around him dance to their tune. They were living up to their name in ways Pearson had never intended, and now all travel to and from Earth had shut down almost completely in light of this new terror. Ostfaller had created a ship for himself that was like no other. The 8 ships that had been lost recently were all freighters carrying goods. Therefore, the ship Sigmund was now in appeared to be a freighter. But he would be a fool to travel now, undefended. In his new bait ship, he set out for Jinx. He could never let his old suspicions die. One problem with being a paranoid. So Jinx was not chosen by accident. Carlos Wu and Beowulf Schaefer were both on Jinx, and most likely, Carlos had been in touch with the Institute of Knowledge. This was a multitasking mission. He could check in on Jinx, the Institute, Beowulf, and Carlos, all while running a mission to discover who was behind the disappearance of the 8 ships. So by no accident, he ran into Carlos and Beowulf, and offered to take them back to Earth with him on his ship. They would surely accept, as their only other choice was to remain stranded on Jinx, seeing as all ships were avoiding Sol. So of course, they did accept. On the trip, Sigmund was pumping Carlos for anything he knew about the Institute, and Beowulf for anything he knew about Gregory Pelton. Beowulf had been sworn to secrecy by Pelton, however, so instead he told Ostfaller of his trip to the planet Gamigi, where the events in the story Grendel take place. They were almost to Earth when the events in the Borderland of Sol take place. After that disaster, Carlos Wu needed new lungs to replace the ones that had been destroyed in the vacuum of space when the dome at Forward Station had collapsed. The autodock in Sigmund's ship had replaced them with donor lungs, but his body had rejected them. Carlos had a very low transplant index, as Gil Hamilton would have said. In other words, it would not accept any tissue other than his own. So once they were back on Earth, Carlos spent months in the hospital as they cloned lungs from his own tissue for him and transplanted those into him. During this time, he came up with a new kind of autodock that would get around these kinds of problems, one based on nanotechnology. In the hospital, he also ended up spending a lot of time with Feather Phillip, as she was assigned by Sigmund to protect him while he was helpless in the hospital. And she stayed assigned to him after that as well, so that Sigmund could keep an eye on him. He had too many close ties with questionable individuals like Gregory Pelton, the secretive trillionaire with ties to Jinx, and Beowulf Schaefer, who always seemed to be involved in the most dangerous situations involving the Earth, spaceflight, and other species. Either Beowulf was a secret agent for an enemy of Earth, or he had horribly bad luck, and since Sigmund was a paranoid, he assumed it was the former. To Sigmund, it all seemed to be connected, but he could not figure out how exactly. Puppeteers had hired Beowulf on more than one occasion. Beowulf had left with Gregory Pelton, who had ties to Jinx, and had later been supposedly vacationing on Jinx. Beowulf had contacted the Outsiders more than once, one of the few, if not the only humans to ever do so. The second time with Pelton involved. The Institute of Knowledge had been involved in both of the only two cases where the vulnerabilities of a puppeteer-manufactured GP Hall had been discovered. The Institute of Knowledge was based out of Jinx. The Institute of Knowledge had funded Dr. Julian Forward. Carlos Wu and Forward were in the same fields of study. Forward had been receiving secret funding from someone after the Institute had cut ties with him, possibly still Jinx under the table, or possibly from puppeteers. Most likely from the puppeteers. Their accounts seemed to have massive sums missing that correlated to money that both the Institute of Knowledge and Forward Station had received. After being laundered several times, of course. The puppeteers would never be so sloppy as to leave a money trail that was definitive. Jinx and its planet of supermen, puppeteers, outsiders, Beowulf Schaefer, Carlos Wu, Dr. Julian Forward, the Institute of Knowledge, all must be tied together somehow. To Sigmund's paranoid mind, it seemed like the only species not connected to this giant conspiracy was the Kzinti, and they had killed his parents when he was only a small child, so he hated them regardless. Was the entire universe out to get Earth? Sigmund was determined to figure out how everything was tied together. He would crack this conspiracy. Eventually, Nessus returned to Earth. His human scouting crew had been found, or rather, had shown themselves from the bridge of their ancestors' colony ship that they had discovered. And now they were demanding independence, and had seemingly gotten it. That was a mess all of its own. But what had been happening on Earth? Was Sigmund still in hot pursuit of the fleet? Had he made any progress? Nessus was both relieved and disgusted to find out the answer to that. Relieved because Dr. Julian Forward had been more successful at deterring Sigmund than he ever would have dared to hope. Disgusted Because of his own volition, Forward had turned to piracy and had destroyed 8 ships along with their crews. Nessus had given Forward the means to make neutronium, but Forward was already searching for the primordial black holes, and it was Forward's idea to feed the neutronium he had made to the primordial black hole he had found, and then use that mass to rob and destroy ships traveling in hyperspace. The destroyed ships had distracted Sigmund, but Nessus was not sure he approved of the death and robbery he had done, that as a side effect had achieved this distraction. It was not even Forward's goal to help Nessus. Nessus had cut his ties with Forward when he left Sol System. Everything after that was Forward's own plan for his own benefit, and his actions had led to his death and the destruction of Forward Station along with everyone on it. The entire thing was a fiasco. Now that Sigmund knew the last 8 ships destroyed were not related to his earlier search, he sent a team out to where the previous 3 had been lost, far to the galactic north. After a long search, they encountered a strange signal, multiple hyperwave signals in quick succession. Sigmund consulted the smartest man he knew about them, Carlos Wu. Carlos did not know for sure, but he thought that they may be a form of hyperwave radar. Hyperwave was instantaneous, so traditional radar pings would not work. But if you could use an array of buoys and make them all directional, then that would allow for a grid to be marked that would allow for the same results. By the time Sigmund sent this theory to his scout ship, it was already too late. They were destroyed, but just before their destruction, they had transmitted a single image back to Earth. The Arm, and by extension, all humanity, now knew the location of the fleet of worlds. This ended all of Nessus's subterfuge, as it was no longer necessary to try and distract Sigmund from his search for the fleet. He had failed at that mission. And therefore, Sigmund also now had nothing to do. He had successfully completed the self-appointed, and later, Arm-appointed, years-long mission to discover the homeworld of the puppeteers. Now, his life felt empty, but his paranoia still would not let him rest, so he continued to use Feather to spy on Carlos Wu and kept tabs on Beowulf Schaefer. When Sigmund's personal AI assistant told him that they were both meeting at Carlos's home, he took notice, but thought little of it. He was more upset that Feather seemed to have left him for Wu. Sigmund and Feather had been in a strange, paranoid relationship for the majority of the time he was searching for the puppeteer homeworld. But when the birthright riots broke out, they began to drift apart. Sigmund was sure the puppeteers were behind them in an attempt to distract the Arm, and therefore himself, from searching for their homeworld. Feather, on the other hand, thought they were legitimate. She started to fixate on the fact that as a paranoid, she was denied the ability to have kids by the world government. Earth was already overpopulated. They would use any excuse to deny people children, to keep the population at a manageable level. Therefore, all people with any kind of genetic anomaly or disability were denied any birthrights. So Feather began to desire Carlos Wu, who, as a top-level genius, was one of only a dozen or so people on the entire planet allowed an unlimited birth license. He could have as many children as he wanted. This is why Beowulf and his wife Cheryl Jans had decided that Cheryl would marry Wu for a few years, have kids, and then she would remarry Beowulf, and they would raise the kids as their own. Beowulf was an albino, and therefore he was denied any birthrights as well, just like Feather and Sigmund. But Feather, even with Carlos Wu, was not allowed to have children. She was a paranoid. She was never allowed to have children on Earth regardless. It was not a numbers issue, as it was with your average person, like Cheryl Jans. It was a genetic issue, so she came up with a plan. This is when the events of Procrustes happen. Feather claimed that Sigmund was hunting Beowulf. Feather claimed that the Earth government would never let Carlos Wu off Earth. But both of these were lies she had invented so she could manipulate Carlos off Earth for her own means, to another planet without a birthright system where she could bear his children. Sigmund had no real concern of Beowulf ever since they had returned on the trip from Jinx together, and Carlos was allowed to go wherever he wanted. Sigmund's real concern was about Feather and how she had stolen a classified armed weapon when she left. She also knew top-level armed secrets, so she was a liability. And on top of that, she had gone off her meds. She was now a raging, unchecked paranoid. She was a danger to the arm and everyone around her. Who knew what she would do? So Sigmund followed her trail to Fafnir to recover her and the weapon. After several months, he found Beowulf, who was much shorter for some reason, and Sigmund had just contacted Beowulf when another of his own agents betrayed him and killed him. This was the second time Sigmund died. Luckily, Nessus was once again tracking down Sigmund, this time for a completely different, personal reason. He needed help with the human colony within the Fleet of Worlds. They had rebelled and taken an entire planet with them, but they had no clue what they were doing. They needed help, or the Concordance would either kill them or reclaim them, and Sigmund was the best man for the job that Nessus could think of. So he saved Sigmund's life, and in return, he kidnapped him. But before Nessus could go back to New Terra and the rest of the fleet, he still had one job to do for the hindmost. So he chartered a spaceship. He had to contact the Outsiders and ensure they would not sell the location of the antimatter planet Gregory Pelton had bought directions to anyone else. That much antimatter would be a massive danger to the fleet. The puppeteers had created a lure to keep one of the starseeds the Outsiders followed in local space, so he had little trouble finding the same ship that Beowulf and Pelton had visited. Once there, he bought the location of the antimatter planet, and then paid quite a bit more to ensure exclusivity on the information so that they would not sell the location to anyone else. Once that was done, the Outsiders had two things they wanted to discuss with Nessus. The first of which was that they noticed one planet of the Fleet of Worlds was moving away from the rest, and when they investigated further, they noticed that its communications were in what sounded like Interworld, the evolved form of English used on all human worlds. The Outsiders had sold the planetary drives to the Concordance, and no one else. If the Concordance was reselling their planetary drives, that would be a breach of contract, and the Outsiders must act, they warned him. As usual, the Outsiders did not elaborate on what they would do, and Nessus was too terrified of them to ask. They were by far the most technologically advanced species the puppeteers knew of. If they decided to attack the fleet, there was nothing the Concordance could do to stop them. Nessus lied and assured them that the planet was still under the control of the Concordance, and said that they were just sending that planet ahead to scout for the rest of the fleet. He could not tell if the Outsiders bought this or not. Instead, they just moved on with their second point of interest. They had discovered a slaver stasis box and inquired if the Concordance would like to buy it. Nessus could not risk another species buying it, so he agreed to pay for it. This is when the events of the short story, The Soft Weapon, occur. After that, Nessus, with Sigmund still in hibernation, returned to the fleet. He dropped Sigmund off with his friends on New Terra, who woke him from his hibernation and informed him of where he was and how they, the other humans, had gotten there. Sigmund was shocked. The puppeteers were worse than his paranoid mind had ever imagined. They had been raising an experimental slave colony of humans since long before Earth even knew puppeteers existed. But this didn't answer why Nessus had brought him here. Nessus had hoped that Sigmund's expertise and paranoia would help New Terra and his friends there survive. They had all been raised to respect, honor, and trust the citizens, as they called them. But Nessus knew how deep and dark the Concordance secrets were, to what lengths they would go in their cowardice to protect themselves. It would take a mind like Sigmund's to keep New Terra safe from the rest of the fleet. And Nessus had only made the situation worse recently. He had to report to the Concordance what the outsiders had said about the possession of their planetary drives and the vague threat they had left him with. And if any of them found out that he had brought Sigmund to New Terra, the Concordance would be even more fearful of New Terra. Nessus erased all of Sigmund's memories of the location of Earth, but he was an arm, part of the protectors of Earth, the people they were most desperate to keep their secrets of the human slave colony from. And here, Nessus had brought one of them to the fleet. Panic was not rational, and many bad decisions had already been made in the past, and only thanks to Nessus, more had very recently been avoided. It had already been proposed to wipe out humanity, which Nessus talked the hindmost out of. And now that the outsiders had made their threat, Achilles was proposing that New Terra either be reconquered or wiped out as well. Despite having come from the same planet originally, the New Terrans and Sigmund were worlds apart. And now, to protect the New Terrans from what they for so long believed were their benevolent benefactors, the puppeteers, Sigmund had to get them on his level somehow. Since his kidnapping to New Terra, Sigmund was beginning to settle in as best he could. He began to build things that New Terra had no concept of, like an intelligence agency, a navy, weapons trainings, and martial arts courses. For most New Terrans, these concepts were not just difficult to grasp, they were difficult to think about. They gave many a visceral feeling of revulsion. The Long Pass, the ship that the puppeteers had abducted them from, had left Earth during a golden age, a time of peace. Humanity had ended all wars and conflicts. Aggression was considered a mental disorder, and since being taken to the fleet, the puppeteers had kept them in that state of mind, so they would not become a threat to the fleet. But after the Long Pass had departed Earth, the Kzinti had attacked humanity. Giant predators that enslaved their enemies, those that they did not eat anyway. This woke humanity back up to the realization that the universe was not as peaceful as the Earth. It showed them that aggression was not a mental disorder, it was a requirement for survival in this violent universe. So the Earth that Sigmund had come from had known many alien species, and none had been as peaceful as the Earth had been when the Long Pass was launched. That was why paranoids like Sigmund were prized on the Earth. Given access to information that your average person did not have, and given high rank in organizations like the Arm. Now, New Terra must face the universe as it truly was, and their first and foremost hurdle to their freedom and survival was the species that had raised them, the puppeteers. Back on Hearth, other minds dwelled on the same problem, but from the other side of the escalating conflict. The outsiders could destroy the fleet. Their threat was not to be taken lightly. One way or another, New Terra's freedom must come to an end. The hindmost, Nike, was desperate and was allowing several paths to solve the issue play out at once. Nessus was ordered to try to bring New Terra back into the fleet of their own accord, without violence. Achilles thought to disable New Terra's planetary drive, which should satisfy the outsiders, as the New Terrans would no longer be in possession of a working planetary drive. But this would leave New Terra to drift through space, uncontrolled and unprotected, as the planetary drives also protected the planet from the hard radiation they received just from traveling through space at such high speeds. Everyone on the planet would either have to live deep underground or would die of radiation poisoning. And Baedeker had been thinking of how the humans had released the Long Pass from inside the Preserver, a supposedly indestructible GP Hall that they had destroyed. Baedeker realized that with just the information that Nessus had given the crew of Explorer when they visited the GP shipyard for Explorer's retrofit, he too could destroy a GP Hall. A GP Hall was one giant supermolecule that was held together with the help of an embedded power plant. That power plant was embedded in an indestructible transparent shell. It could not be damaged by anything, but it could still be attacked by light. If he could use a laser to send a signal to the power plant through the transparent hull, he could command it to shut down. All he had to do was induce the right electrical and optical frequencies, and he could control it remotely. And all it would take was just a simple communications laser to do it. So Nike ordered Baedeker and Achilles to destroy New Terra's small navy. All of their ships, save the Long Pass, were built in GP hulls, so they sent out a probe for each ship, and then, when given the command, they used Baedeker's technique to shut down all the hulls of the New Terran fleet, and used a cutting laser to slice the Long Pass into pieces. Now, New Terra had no ships at all. They were defenseless, and had no way to attack or defend themselves. The first blow had been struck in the New Terra Puppeteer War. It had come without warning, and had been utterly devastating. But Sigmund had expected it nonetheless. One of the GP hulls the puppeteers had destroyed was an empty shell. All the working parts had been removed and put inside another hidden hull hastily made by the New Terrans out of normal materials. This one vulnerable ship was all that Sigmund needed. So in secret, he and his crew set out to hyperspace. They had discovered where Nessus had last spoken with the outsider ship, the one that had delivered its ultimatum to him, and that is where they headed. If the outsiders could scare the puppeteers into attacking New Terra, maybe, if Sigmund could make the right deal with them, he could convince the outsiders to scare the puppeteers into never attacking New Terra again. It was his only hope. But when Sigmund finally found the outsider ship, Nessus was already there. This confused Sigmund, as they had to search for a while to find the ship, but it seemed Nessus had gone straight to it. How was this possible? Sigmund tried to sell information to the outsiders in exchange for giving New Terra control of the planetary drive they were using, thereby stopping the threat they made to the Concordance. This would, in theory, take away the Concordance's reason to try and take back control of New Terra. The information Sigmund tried to sell them was the story of how New Terra came into existence, which included the fact that the Concordance had been keeping a secret slave colony of humans. But even when Sigmund pointed out to the outsiders that this information would be valuable to the rest of the humans in known space, they disagreed and said it was only an interspecies squabble, and they would take no part in it. Sigmund then stated that he believed that the outsiders were actually made up of a very small population. Or how else would it be possible that if there were millions or billions of outsider ships covering the entire galaxy, that the ship they were on would only be ship number 14? The chances that they would run into a low-number ship like that, and only that ship, multiple times, should be incredibly small. And yet here they were on ship 14, the same ship Beowulf had been on twice before. This seemed to upset the outsiders, but they refused to confirm his suspicions and tried to end the meeting at that point. But something clicked in Sigmund's mind. Maybe it wasn't a coincidence that it was always ship number 14. Maybe there was a reason why Nessus beat him to the outsiders. So in desperation, Sigmund told the outsiders of his theory for how Nessus had reached them before he had. Nessus, despite being a puppeteer, was also the biggest advocate for humanity among the Concordants, so he admitted to the outsiders that the Concordants had developed a way to lure the starseeds that the outsiders followed. And he pointed out to them how, if they could get a hold of this technology, they would be able to lead the starseeds safely away from the Milky Way galaxy, which was currently exploding and sending a wave of death in their direction. Without this tech, when the wave of radiation from the exploding galactic core reached them, it would kill the starseeds. Neither Nessus nor Sigmund knew what connection the outsiders had with the starseeds, But their feeling that it must be important seemed to be correct, for the outsiders took the deal, and New Terra was now allowed to use the planetary drive. There was no longer any reason for the Concordants to think that if they did not recover New Terra, or at a minimum its planetary drive, to their control, they might potentially be wiped out by the outsiders. So when he received this news, Nike, the hindmost, recalled all of the scouts he had set working on ways of retrieving New Terra, including Nessus, Baedeker, and Achilles. Unfortunately, Achilles had never believed he was subservient to anyone, and so he continued on his plan to destroy the planetary drive on New Terra. He was going to impact the site that held the drive with massive probes from space. He was accelerating them through the atmosphere and down towards the surface of the planet when, in fear and desperation, Baedeker, who had been studying the drives and knew more about them than anyone, kicked Achilles in the brain case and knocked him unconscious. No one knew what would happen if those probes obliterated a planetary drive. What if they released all the energy they used to move the planet? It would shatter the planet into a billion world-ending sized asteroids and send many of them right at the rest of the fleet. It was possible that Achilles' actions would destroy all the worlds that made up the fleet. So Baedeker had had no choice. He was forced to do what no puppeteer ever wanted to do. Instead of running away, he was forced to attack. And so he did, possibly saving the life of every puppeteer, and assuredly saving the life of every human on New Terra. So let's talk a little about this novel. It was a strange book, to be sure. It tied in a lot of the short stories of the known space universe and tried to explain some of the reasons things happened. Not really a retcon, just an explanation for things that didn't quite make sense before, or had been left as unanswered questions. And in that regard, I think Larry Niven did a very good job. But the ending, I feel like maybe Niven wrote himself into a corner a bit. He not only had to solve the problems he had created for New Terra in the first novel, he also completely defanged New Terra in this novel. So his solution was the enigmatic outsiders. But things didn't quite sit right with me for that ending. The outsiders threatened the Concordants for giving up one of their planetary drives in violation of their agreement. Sigmund explained this as that the outsiders were actually fewer and weaker than they portrayed themselves. I feel like this was all just to explain why it was Ship 14 that everyone dealt with, a single ship with a low number, and to renew the puppeteer's fear of New Terra's independence. Maybe I'm missing something, but I feel like he didn't need to invent this issue. He could have just not made the exclusivity clause a thing. Therefore, the outsiders would not care that New Terra operated the planetary drive. And then the explanation for it being Ship 14 could have been explained in many other ways. We already knew that the puppeteers were keeping Ship 14 in local space in case they needed something from the outsiders. So, always interacting with that ship is not really a surprise. And the fact it was 14, a low number, could have been explained by saying something along the lines of 14 refers to the outsider ship's model, and there were actually thousands of Ship 14s. Or maybe it was just a name, 14 having some kind of meaning to the outsiders, much like how there are a lot of yachts called the Lucky Seven in real life. And the outsiders do not number their ships in the first place. It's just a name, the 14. But that's not really what bothers me with this ending. What bothers me is that the ancient outsiders, the beings who invented the hyperdrive and who can move city-sized ships to and from light speed with no release of energy, the inventors of the planetary drives and who follow starseeds for their entire lives, have never figured out how to control the starseeds. But the puppeteers have? When I first read that part of the novel, I expected them to scoff at the thought that they could not control the starseeds. I expected them to say they felt doing such a thing would be tantamount to sacrilege, that they knew how and chose not to, or at least that they knew the Concordants had been doing that. Instead, they took the deal without comment. I love Niven and the known space universe, but I feel that this was one of the weakest solutions in all of his novels. And it was in a book that's main point was to tie up loose ends. To use that, the loosest of all ends, to solve the problem, felt wrong. So I just had to say something. I get that he put himself in a bad spot, and this novel happens before the Ringworld novels, so they had to end in the right spot for that to happen, with the right people doing the right things and having access to the right information, and I'm sure that was very difficult. So for just this one time, I'll give him a pass. Most authors use what I would consider to be Deus Ex on a regular basis, and Niven rarely does. He may use a lot of coincidences, but that just makes sense if you don't want an army of characters by the end of each book. Plus, he even has an in-universe explanation for that. The human luck breeding program the puppeteers started, which, to be honest, I don't really agree with, as luck doesn't feel very hard sci-fi. But if we want the stories to be entertaining and not have a new main character for every incident, we do need something like that. Now, with that being said, I feel like the rest of the Fleet of Worlds series is some of Niven's best writing, so the next few novels are much more exciting in my opinion. So let's put this little problem behind us and move on to the next novels. Hey, thanks for watching. I really appreciate you staying this long, and since you did, hopefully that means you like my channel. So I'd really appreciate it if you would like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe, so I can see you back here for the next one. Take care.